Welcome back. We were able to get a hold of Frank J. Lechner. He's a professor at Emory College of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Sociology. Again, a very busy professor. He didn't have a lot of time, but we did ask him, how do you view political polarization right now? And this is roughly what he had to say. So this was the issue he had done. So do you think political polarization has increased since you did this interview in 2018? So in 2018, or 5 years ago, about half a decade ago, Trump was still president. We are in the middle of the Trump presidency. This is 2018. Trump was elected in 2016. We're in the middle of the Trump presidency. And Frank Lechner was talking about symmetric polarization or Republican radicalism. And one of the things that I liked about his interview was that he was one of a few lecturers to bring up something that I've only heard from a few professors, maybe like 3 or 4. And that is that the social sciences, especially social psychology and the people who are studying political division, is dominated by people on the left. So there's almost nobody who's a conservative or an independent who works in psychology or social psychology or sociology or government or any of the fields that's studying political polarization and isn't on the left. And that means the entire field is biased, in his opinion. He's not alone. There's like 3 or 4 other researchers who said, if everybody in the field has a political bias, you cannot just give blank trust to the conclusions from that field because it's biased. So I think Lee Jessam was one. Corey Clark was one. There was another study recently, the last couple of years, where they also were taking that stance. And Frank Lechner's another one. Frank Lechner's a conservative. And what I found interesting in this interview was that this is 5 years ago, and they're talking about polarization and how to fix it. And Frank Lechner was talking to the interviewer and saying, just the questions you ask about polarization, trying to get at the cause, frames it as though it's all the Republicans' fault and the Democrats have done absolutely nothing wrong. And I found that fascinating. There were 2 professors doing this interview on Heterodox Academy. Chris Martin, we've already interviewed, and then Frank Lechner, who we're talking about now. And it was interesting to see that they were having a discussion on political polarization, and Frank Lechner had to keep bringing up the way you even frame the questions that you view as dispassionate and unbiased and just getting at the trying to understand, frame the situation as though it's all Republicans' faults. So they did that like 4 or 5 times in this interview. He's like, great question. Once again, the question already frames the answer. And so he kind of concluded with, there's a lot of bias in the industry, and he's not alone. Lee Jessam said that. Corey Clark said that. A couple other people said that. And you could definitely see something like that on display in this interview, where just the framing of the questions really did kind of frame it as, well, we already know the answer is the Republicans, right? So, and it wasn't perceived as framing the questions. It was just perceived as being independent and just going off what the data shows. And he goes, it's so biased. That was his point. So the information is very biased against conservatives. It's not looking at it equally, which we just saw with the interview we did a second before, where one of the researchers who wrote a book called Fault Lines a couple of years ago, and it was supposed to take an even look at all the things that made polarization, has now switched to stance to, we don't really need to talk about polarization. We need to talk about how the right is hardcore radical. The exact same kind of bias that Frank Lechner was pointing out in this interview here, still on display. We talked to Kevin Cruz, and did an interview on that where he had said it's not about polarization, it's about the hardcore radical right. I talked to him this week, and we posted that today. And then here's an interview from Frank Lechner 5 years ago, talking about how the left is biased against the right, looking into this. And I can literally say, we had an example this week of that. So he's not alone. Other people have made that point. But here's the interesting thing. So they're talking about polarization. It's 2018, 2 years into the Trump presidency. The attitude is blame everything on Trump. And he's saying, well, yes, Trump did a lot of things, but the Democrats did a couple things too. So it was interesting to see that. And that if he didn't bring that up, it looked like the things that Democrats had also done to spread polarization would have never been brought up and never been discussed if he didn't bring it up himself. Just my impression. Just my impression. Maybe I'm wrong. So I asked him, do you think polarization has increased since this very contentious, aggressive interview you did in 2018 with a liberal professor 5 years ago? Yes. But the issue is empirically complicated. So what that means is I'm a professor. I'm not going to tell you yes because I haven't looked at data and published a study. Totally respect that. These are people who are trained to not make statements unless they can prove it. But asking him off the top of his head, do you think things are more polarized now than 2 years into the Trump presidency when everybody was ripping their hair out and acting like it was the end of the world? And he says, yeah, it's probably more polarized than that, which is a very damning and scary conclusion. And it came from this man. Small data point, but it's another important data point. We'll leave it there, and we'll see you soon.